Welcome to the Woodward Chronicles. This series is dedicated to honoring the legacy of Mr. Ronald Woodward, who served as Wabash County Historian from 1981 to 2025 and was awarded the title of Wabash County Historian Emeritus by the Indiana Historical Society. Mr. Woodward shares Wabash County's recorded history in his own words. Each episode invites us to listen, learn, and reflect on the rich stories from the past. Settle in, we're glad you're here.
What I want you to know is that in the early days of Wabash County, there were other places that people went for amusement that we don't think of as amusement parks. For instance, out on Stitz Street, at the corner of Falls and Stitz Street, right across from the cemetery, that was called Fiddler's Green. And in the early days, people would have their picnics and parties there, and it became known as Fiddler's Green because they would have dances there. Fiddlers would show up and they'd play their Virginia reels or what kind of music they had that was popular in those days, and people would gather and dance and have picnics and just have a good time. And we still commemorate that site. It's still called Fiddler's Green among old-timers, and that's where they gathered to have fun in the early days. And when I say early days, before 1900. Another place in town that we don't think of as being amusement, but kind of shows what happened in our community, out on Pike Street, where Yankee Road comes into Pike Street, that used to be called Monkey Town. It got its name Monkey Town because a circus wagon loaded with monkeys was on its way to Peru to the winter grounds there and broke down. Now, there used to be a blacksmith shop there, and the blacksmith said he'd fix the wagon, and he gave him a price, and the man said, "I can't afford that. What if I put on a show for all the kids in the neighborhood?" And the blacksmith said, "If you'll do that, that's fine." So Monkey Town got its name because of the monkey show that was put on there by this traveling monkey show wagon that had broken down there and been fixed, in paying for its repairs in that manner. And of course, I mentioned Jocko last time with you. Jocko was the escaped monkey from a circus that took over Wabash and haunted it for many years, and led to many people thinking that there was a large clandestine group of monkeys that lived in false cemeteries in the trees. Interesting story, but that's what happened. So those were forms of entertainment in those real early days. About 1897, things began to change. People began to have, believe it or not, a little bit more spending money. The average factory worker made about 10 to 25 cents a day. And he had considerable amount of money left over at the end of the week, $4, maybe a little bit more than that. And he wanted some form of entertainment. People wanted entertainment after working 6 days a week, 10 hours a day at those kind of wages. So we had several places that started to offer amusements, and by that term they meant picnicking, boating, horseback riding, dancing, and there were several places that developed to meet that need. One of them was Hanging Rock over in LeGros. Hanging Rock was an amusement center. People would actually take a sternwheeler, a small boat, steamboat, that had either a wheel on the side or on the back, and it would hold about 20 people. And people from all over would come to LeGros and take that boat, which they called the Lady Washington, and take it up to Hanging Rock and spend the day, where they would picnic, fish, dance. At one point, for many years, the bands in the county, the local bands that had formed, would go there and have a band competition as well. So that was an early amusement center. Then there was the next one that developed was down at Somerset, and that was called Pearson's Mill. Pearson's Mill had been abandoned for a number of years. It was a 3-story grist mill and had been abandoned, and a man by the name of Pearson from Wabash bought it and turned it into an inn. He had an inn there and small rooms for people to stay in. He had a restaurant, dining room, and he had a ballroom on the second floor. And you could go there on a Saturday night, Sunday, or whenever you wanted to, and spend a few days relaxing in the outdoors where you could dance and swim and boat, and swings were created around the area so you could just sit and swing and watch the Mississinawa River roll by. Of course, there was a dam there, so there was plenty of boating, and they also had a sternwheeler, which they called the Miami, and you could go on a pleasure cruise on the Mississinawa River. Then, to compete with it, there was something called Ulry's Landing. Ulry's Landing today we know is Long Lake, and it was also a recreational center where people could go for mainly boating and swimming and fishing and picnicking. They also held dances, and they were known for their tremendously large water slide. I mean, we think of water slides as something new, but back then they had about a 3 or 4 story tall slide, and you would go up to the top of it and slide down into the water. And it was a main attraction, as well as this aluminum horse. I don't know if you've ever seen one of these. They're floating images that look like a barrel that looks like a horse, and you could ride that. And people would try and ride it, and it was kind of like riding the bull that you see today, these mechanical bulls. You'd get on and the waves would slop you around and you'd go falling and people would laugh at you. It was amusing. Well, they also had Lucan's Lake. Lucan's Lake was really an attraction for the North Manchester area and surrounding counties. They always featured bands that played the local music, had dancing, oftentimes free. They would even show kinograph movies. They would have ball games, picnics, everything was there for your amusement. But about 1901, things began to change. People were looking for more avenues of entertainment. And a man by the name of Boyd had come up with an idea of connecting Fort Wayne and Peru with an interurban attraction railroad company. And in order to attract people, he decided to set up an amusement park at Rich Valley. It was an 18-acre park located just off of Old 24, bordering the Wabash River, about 18 acres in size, and it was truly an amusement park. It was long before Indiana Beach, but it was just as popular as Indiana Beach. Today you go by, it's a cornfield, but in those days, from 1901 until about 1910, as many as, this is hard to believe, but as many as 8,000 people would attend on a day, especially on the 4th of July or something going on special. As many as 8,000. In fact, one day they could not get the people out of the park and home until about 4:45 in the morning. The cars would only hold so many people, and there were so many there. They told people, if you want to get home quick, walk to Wabash. And many people did, but most took the interurban.
Okay, that's what I was wondering. So they used the interurban to move between Fort Wayne and Peru into Rich Valley.
Right.
And this Mr. Boyd, was he from Wabash?
No, he wasn't. He was out of the Fort Wayne area and had set up the traction company. Now, before he actually took complete control of the traction company, the interurban started in Wabash at Ford Meter Box on Manchester Avenue, went down Manchester Avenue to Wabash Street, to Columbus Street, to Vernon, to Pike, and went on out Pike Street in the middle of the road, on out Pike Street to Cooper Road, and then to Rich Valley. And you could get off there and go into the amusement park. Either walk across the bridge or you could take a boat. They had a steamboat also. They had a stern wheeler, which they called the toga, that you could ride on and cross the river. So you had a variety of ways to get to the park. Once you got to the park, there were 2 pavilions, all kinds of rides, all kinds of anything you might associate with like Indiana Beach or an amusement park, little restaurant type places. One of the pavilions was used as a dance hall and was also used as a movie theater. So they would have what they called kinescope movies there, silent movies that you could go in and watch. They had dances. Dances cost 25 cents to go to for men. Women were free. If you were a single woman, here was your chance to meet up with a bunch of guys. And there were always single guys who wanted to dance with a young lady and were willing to pay 25 cents to do that. Wabash had dance halls, as did surrounding communities, where a man would go in and pay a lady 5 cents for each dance. And she would split that with whoever owned the dance hall. They'd keep 2.5 cents and she'd keep 2.5 cents. And that's how some people made their living, and it was a form of entertainment. And they carried that down to Boyd Park, but they went a little bit further. You pay 25 cents, you can dance as much as you want, and believe it or not, the ladies are free to dance with and all. So it attracted them as well. Some of the rides that they had, it is claimed, we can't really prove it, but it is claimed that they had the very first roller coaster in Indiana. The very first. It was called the Railway, and it wasn't like what you see today. And it took up a good 5 or 6 acres and was about 3 to 4 stories tall. But they didn't have individual wagons like you're used to sitting in, little individual cars. What they had was you stood up in a wagon. 8, 10 people would get in the wagon and stand on it, and then they would have you go up and down and on this roller coaster and just have fun. It was called the Scenic Highway, and there was one accident that we know of. Nobody was seriously hurt, but one time the car just was going too fast when it came to the end of the ride and went off and spilled some people. By 1911, when the park closed, that Scenic Railway roller coaster was moved to Trier Park in Fort Wayne, which was another park that was set up by the traction company to promote their business and get people to ride the interurban. There were other rides that you would associate with any amusement park.
Was there a Ferris wheel?
Kind of a loop-de-loop type affair with cars fastened inside. You went in circles around it. There were also flying cars. These were set up kind of like airplanes, and you sat in them and then flew around. Swinging chairs, that kind of thing. As well as the rides, you had boating. You could rent a boat and go on river, or you could take the toga and ride the river in the steamboat for your pleasure. One occasion, a young man and his girlfriend were going upriver on a boat that they rented, and the young lady somehow noticed something large and dark sitting on sandbar in the middle of the river. And she drew her boyfriend's attention to it. And he began looking at it. And it was a huge fish about the size of this room. And it created quite a stir among people, and people were going down to try and find it and to capture it. It was probably a catfish because they can get 60, 70, 80 pounds in the Wabash River. They can get very large in size. Another time, someone spotted an alligator at Rich Valley.
Sure they did.
And all the farmers turned out with all kinds of gigs and anything to catch this alligator. They never did, but it was reported to have been seen. And if you remember a few years ago, as far east at Andrews, they spotted 2 alligators just a couple of years ago in the Wabash River.
Is
And
that
as a side,
somebody's pet that they've released, do you think?
no one knew. No one knew. They were huge in size. We're talking 10, 11, 12 feet. We're not talking small. Now, there was a teacher in Wabash in the 1930s who had a pet alligator. He taught at Wabash High School. He was a science teacher out there, and he used to walk it around town. But that's another story for another time. But that was the place to go on the weekend and for special occasions, Memorial Day, Labor Day, and other holidays, 4th of July in particular. They had their own baseball team. They're called the Boyd Parkers. And you could go and watch them play baseball, and they would play local teams from counties around. They had all kinds of entertainment in the pavilion that you can imagine. Besides having a kinescope movie theater, they also had live entertainment. They had vaudeville acts. They had some of the most popular vaudeville acts of the early 1900s. Some of the acts included singers, whistlers. One of the most famous acts was a magic lantern show. A magic lantern is they would take glass slides and a man would take you on a travelogue and show you slides of what he was talking about, say Switzerland, what it was like. Also, there was a man from Wabash who was known for his magic lantern shows, and what he featured was singing. He would sing the popular Tin Pan Alley hits of the day, Bicycle Built for Two, things like that. And after he sang it, he would put magic lantern slides up and show a scene and have the words to the song, and the audience would sing along. They also had circuses, Wild West shows, major bands of the day, the New York City Metropolitan Band. Some people say that John Philip Sousa performed there. I don't think he did, but some say he did. And I do know that he was here in Wabash and performed at the Eagles Theater. So it's quite likely that he might have. In 1909, their acts started going down. They were getting second and third rate vaudeville acts because their attendance was starting to fall and the quality of acts on the road wasn't the same. Vaudeville was having a really rough time and silent movies were beginning to take their place. And places like Eagles Theater, Dreamland. At one time, Wabash had 4 different movie theaters, Nickelodeons, that you could go and attend for a nickel, go in and watch a movie, and someone play the piano or play a violin to provide the music. So they were competing with that. And their shows started to slip. They started inviting in kind of questionable acts, the 50 most beautiful girls in the United States. We kind of talked about that the last time.
Little Egypt?
Well, not Little Egypt, but they were similar, and they showed just a little bit more flesh than Little Egypt did, as she wore mainly skin-colored tights. They were a little bit more risque in their form. In fact, one of the local theaters in town I believe it was the Eagles, put an ad in the paper that they were unlike Boyd Park in that they would not show that kind of entertainment to the public. It just was not proper. They had plays. You could go see plays of all sorts, comedies. They had monoped acts. Don't ask me how you could do that. A monoped was a person who had just one leg, and they would perform on bicycles, and they would do tightrope walking acts and that kind of thing for entertainment. By 1910, they had been in trouble with the law so much that they were beginning to think of closing, and by 1911, they were closed. They were breaking the blue laws. In those days, there were things called blue laws in which certain things couldn't be done on Sunday. Movie theaters couldn't perform. You couldn't have vaudeville acts. And they went ahead and did it anyway. And at least 4 or 5 times they were hauled into court and fined for having the wrong kind of entertainment, questionable entertainment, and it was becoming a burden for them. The park was going downhill, and attendance was slipping. Although in its last year, they did have, on a 4th of July, they did have as many as 4,000 people there on the 4th of July. And they had ball games, and at that time, they actually had an airplane land there as well. They also had hot air balloons that would ascend, and you could ride in those as well. So quite a variety of entertainment was being provided at the park. But believe it or not, places like Lucan's Lake, Friendship Park, which was at Laketon, and even down at Somerset, those parks were beginning to cut into their income. Even the Wabash City Park became a place to go for an attraction. It competed very heavily with Boyd Park. I know that's hard to believe, but besides the pavilion, they had the you can still see the circular racetrack in the middle of the park. The circular racetrack for horse racing and for bicycle racing was located there. They had a bandstand where bands would perform. Chautauquas were starting to come in, and our Chautauquas lasted for a whole week, and they provided all kinds of entertainment to not only the older people, but to the youth of Wabash County for a number of years. Those were beginning to take its place. There were other things in the park as well. To us, they don't seem important, but horseshoe pitching was a skill that was very well appreciated, and people would go down and pitch horseshoes, and there'd be all kinds of competitions for that, as well as the bicycle racing. The bicycle racing was a fad that started in the 1890s and went on up until the 1910s. I even have a picture at home of Mark Honeywell, who was a big enthusiast on bicycles. He's on his bicycle. He was hired by girls to escort them on trips out to places like Spikerville. Now, that doesn't sound like a big trip, and today you have your big bicycle race and all that kind of thing. But back then, young ladies needed to be escorted, and he would escort them out there and protect them. By the way, on the way out, they went by a farm, and some of the cows got loose and chased the girls. So they were sitting on the fence, scared to death, screaming and yelling about these cows that were attacking them. They had races starting from the courthouse to LeGros over the old LeGros Road, which was gravel. And they had the bicycle races, and their time was amazing. They could make the 5-mile distance in about 15 minutes on their bicycles in those days. Yes, they were tremendous. And they block off the road just like you have blocked off intersections for bicycle. Just the same thing, but that was going on as early as the 1900s. And of course, they had out at the park, you had that round oval track, and people would just get on there. They would have races almost every weekend. They would have races out there. Hard to believe, but that actually happened. Now, much later in the 1950s, we used the city park for another kind of race that most people have forgotten about. We had a midget racing track out there in the 1950s. And not only boys, but girls raced their midget racers out there in the park. What's unbelievable is where it was located. It wasn't on the oval track. It was down where the basketball courts are. If you go out Market Street, right before you get to Charlie Creek, there's a little gravel road that goes off to the side. If you go back that, it'll take you to the basketball courts. And that's where they held their midget racetrack. Hard to believe that we had that, but we did. And quite a few prominent citizens of Wabash today race their midgets down there as well. And when race drivers who won the Indy 500 would come to Wabash to go to Dick's clothing store, he would always give them a $1,000 gift certificate to buy whatever clothes they wanted. They would always have the midgets escort them into town in their cars in front of them and have them sit out front of Dick's clothing store. So a lot of things we had back then, we still have, but in a different form, or had much later than what we might have imagined or thought of.
Was there a racetrack behind Real Alloy at one point, a horse track behind what's now Real Alloy, was once Wabash Alloys, by the Samuel McClure home?
I do not know of a racetrack that was behind Alloys. Alloys moved there in the 1960s, early 1960s, after the fire that destroyed the plant downtown, the smelting plant downtown. I've never heard of one out there, but I have heard of a racetrack out by Higley Curve. If you go on out Old 24, and when it makes that big bend and it goes straight off to the right, there's a trailer court out there. Behind the trailer court, there used to be, from what I've been told, a racetrack for midgets, but they may have raced other things there as well. I don't know of anyone out at Alloys. However, out on Manchester Avenue, about 1880s, 90s, there was a racetrack. The Asher Gray racetrack was out off Manchester Avenue, but I don't know much more about it. And it may not have been Asher Gray, but it was a Gray who ran that.
When you talk about midgets, those are small kind of cars, correct?
They're small.
Like little race cars almost?
Small race cars, yes.
Yeah. And there's still that midget race car racing that takes place in Indiana today. I've seen some tracks on my travels in Indiana that there's still midget race car racing.
Right.
Yeah.
Out on 24, outside of Logansport at Lake Saccott, there still is a dirt racetrack for midgets out there.
When you talk about Boyd Park closing in 1911, the structure sat abandoned for quite some time. Do you recall when the structure might have been torn down?
The power plant to provide the power for the interurban and for the amusement grounds themselves, that was destroyed during a fire before 1920. The other buildings generally were made of lumber, and they were torn down and used for other things. The pavilions were of brick, and when they actually came down, I don't really know. But I do know that as late as 1920s, around 1923, 4, and 5, the park was still being used for picnics. but it was just the grounds that people were using. In 1911, there was talk of turning it into a golf course.
In 1911?
In 1911, there was talk of turning it into a golf course, but that never came about. But by 1920, you have a golf course in Wabash, which would surprise you. It was off of North Wabash Street and Harrison, where the school is, O.J. Neighbors. That entire area was the golf course, and they had a country club out there, which existed for up and through the 40s, maybe even to the early 50s when they had a fire and destroyed the clubhouse. And then they began building houses out there, and you have housing projects go up from that area. But along North Wabash and Harrison, that was the golf course until they moved out to Indiana 15.
Would golf courses or tennis, would that have also at that time been considered amusement as well?
Oh, yes. In fact, in the 1920s, Wabash was taken by storm by miniature golf courses. And we had several miniature golf courses set up in Wabash. There was a golf course out on Manchester Avenue. There was a golf course out on Highway Indiana 15 across from the country club. Well, the golf course today. And then right next to your business downtown, the old Reddig building, they had an indoor miniature golf course in the Reddig building. And over in the Hotel Indiana, they also had an indoor golf course there as well. So at one time we had as many as three at one time, miniature golf courses. Now they attracted just a certain group of people. Most people could afford miniature golf, but you had an older generation that really enjoyed golf in its pure sense. And there was a big fad in the 20s and 30s to set up golf courses. And my grandfather got caught up in that, and he bought a farm, an 80-acre farm near Salem, Indiana, and set up a golf course. The thing was, nobody could find it. Nobody knew where it was, and he lost his shirt.
Oh, poor grandpa.
But that was a fad, and people were sucked into it and enjoyed it. Tennis was popular as early as the 1910s. Even Rich Valley had a tennis court, which, by the way, I didn't mention it. Boyd Park actually had a hotel, and Rich Valley had a hotel. So they had two hotels within a half a mile of each other, and people would stay overnight there. You wouldn't have thought that small town would have a hotel, but it did. And that's how Friendship Park, what we call Lucan's Lake today, that's how it got its start, with the hotel. And the hotel is still standing at Lucan's Lake. Dr. Mattern owns the hotel. If you know, it's a white house.
Yeah.
It sits there near the intersection. And if you'll look, the next time you go by his house, if you'll look to the west, you'll see the sign going into Friendship Park. It'll say Friendship Park, and it's made out of stone. And his house was the hotel. It's hard to believe these places existed, but they did. And some of them are still, or parts of them, are still to be found or around today.
Well, travel wasn't as convenient as it is today. So you stayed closer. You know, the interurban obviously was that first form of large capacity travel, you know, and so if you went from Fort Wayne to Rich Valley, that was a thing, you know, for them to build capacity around each community because nobody wanted to travel as far, I would imagine. Right. Is that right? Right.
And plus, it cost only 10 cents to go from Fort Wayne to Rich Valley to ride the interurban. Now, that was a lot of money. I mean, 10 cents is what's the average man made in an hour, but it was affordable and you could do that. But places like Lucan's Lake and the hotel at Friendship Park attracted people from as far as Chicago. They could get there by train. Lucan's Lake would actually have a tram a wagon that would meet you either in Laketon, if you were going on the railroad that ran through Laketon, or at North Manchester and bring you out to the park. And it only cost about $1.25 a day to stay there. And that included not only your housing and your entertainment, but your food as well in the cost.
Would that have been per person, do you know?
Per
or
person.
Okay. So it was
But
like
if you brought a family, they had family rates. At Lucan's Lake, they had cabins that you could rent and stay in and at your convenience. And then you could go up to the hotel to eat lunch or supper or breakfast at your convenience when you wanted to. Much different than today and slow paced. Some people even claim that as late as the late 20s and 30s, that people like Al Capone, his associates, had actually stayed at Friendship Park. I mean, there are people who claim that. I don't know that to be a fact or not, but it's entirely possible. It was only an hour and a half, 2-hour ride by train to come down here from Chicago. And of course, places like Weona Lake were very popular and attracted people from the Chicago area as well. And their large hotels are still standing today.
Was it common, all of these amusement areas in Wabash County, was that common in all small communities, Miami County, Grant County, or was that something special to Wabash County to have this plethora of amusement options?
I wouldn't say other communities had, in other counties, had their forms of entertainment too, and they had small places where people could escape and enjoy life and have amusements on their own. We shared a lot of ours with other counties, Lucan's Lake, Long Lake, and there was a place called the Falls in North Manchester that would attract people from Kosciuszko County and Whitley County who just wanted to get out of their county and go see something new that was close by. But on the other hand, they had Silver Lake, places like that where they could go for amusement, and Warsaw. So I would say counties had their own forms of entertainment and places to go. However, from 1901 to 1910, the premier location in northern Indiana, would have been Boyd Park. It was the Indiana beach of the day. It was the place to go and be seen. Your other places attracted smaller groups, 100, 200, 300, maybe on a special occasion like Pearson's Mill. Pearson's Mill on Memorial Day attracted as many as 4,000 people, even higher than that. Sometimes they would have a guest speaker. The governor of the state would come up and speak at Little Somerset, and you get 4,000, 6,000, 8,000 people who would show up for the day. And there was enough entertainment for them and enough things to do that they were entertained for the entire day. So we had a number of them, but what we had going that a lot of people didn't was the source of transportation. To get to Boyd Park, you not only had the interurban, which only stretched down to Peru in those early days. Oh, you could get to Peru and then you could go down to Indianapolis from there. I mean, it went elsewhere, but as far as going west. So you had local, but not crowds that you were seeing in Wabash.
And Richard Boyd must have saw that location as key because you started out sharing, that was a key meeting place between Miami County and Fort Wayne, Allen County to be at Boyd Park, correct? Like he must have scouted that out?
Well, if I would have been him, I would have put it in Wabash.
Well.
Because you have a north-south, east-west trains, as well as the interurban, plus you have major roads. Back then, Rich Valley didn't have a north-south railroad. You had to come into Wabash, and then you had to take the interurban over or go into Peru and take the interurban over. So I think he saw available land. He saw a good location, and he knew that he could make it into something. Plus, he needed ever so often along the inner urban, you had to have a power station to provide your source of electricity. In Wabash County, you had 2 power stations, one at LeGros, which is still standing today. The interurban station is Candy's.
Like the brick building by
The brick
White
building that
Rock.
Candy
and
owns,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
That was the power station and the station itself. And then you had the one at Rich Valley. So you needed 2 within about a 30-mile radius. Every 15 miles, you needed one, I would say. So that's where you ended up with one.
Mm-hmm.
But he had foresight. Again, I would have picked a better location if it were me, because there wasn't that much in Rich Valley as there was in Wabash.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, that was good, because if you had lesser activities, they would go to your park and stay at your park and spend their money at your park and go on.
When the Boyd Park closed, that type of old wooden roller coaster structure closed, that was the last of its kind for years in Northeast Indiana. Would you agree with that?
Well, when it first opened, it was those large cars that you stood up in. When it closed, it was down to a smaller car that you rode in, and the entire structure was moved to Trier Park.
Right.
Now, whether it was the same cars or not, I don't know. I don't know at all.
Could people in the late 30s, 40s, 50s here ever see remnants of Boyd Park? Or would it have been completely obsolete and gone visibly by then?
The only records I've seen is up to the early 1920s, when it was being used kind of as a picnic grounds, but there weren't any structures in it. And when it reverted back to a cornfield, I really don't know.
I met with Sandy Kunkel, and I was talking to her about you sharing about Boyd Park, and she thought she could remember seeing it on her way to Peru abandoned, parts of it abandoned. And so that's why I was asking you, maybe she was recalling it differently than...
The hotel burned down before the 1930s.
Yeah.
I don't know. I've never talked with anybody who ever went to the park.
Yeah.
Ron Thrush and I talked a lot about it, and he went there an awful lot. And he remembered going down by interurban on the south side of the river and in open cars where you sat facing out instead of inward. And he remembered that, but he didn't remember seeing
it
any
after.
Structures at all.
Yeah.
Now, as you take that road back from Rich Valley to the bridge, there are 4 houses there, and whether they were originally there or not, I don't know. They look like they might have been built about the time of the park, but whether they were there or not, I don't know. Mm-hmm. Those would have been the only structures, I think, that would have been visible in the 40s and 50s.
And I don't know her age. And she said she was a really little girl when she thought she could recall that. But sometimes it could just be, you think that you saw a photograph or something, and she thought she could recall going to Peru with her family on her, that back way into Peru as a little girl, and could see remnants of that there now. I don't know.
She might have seen those buildings that are still standing, and that might have been what she was seeing, and thought it was part of it.
Yeah, the old park. Yeah. When you think about amusements and Boyd Park or areas or vaudeville performances, movie theaters, the circus, would that have been would the circus have come and performed at Boyd Park? Would that have been a type of amusement? I know the last time we talked a little bit about circuses and performers coming to town as a form of entertainment, but would circuses have performed independent, or would they have always come to a spot of amusement to then perform?
The circuses that performed at Boyd Park, from what I've read, were specialty circuses, like a Wild West show, and they would have a special theme. The circuses that performed there would have been that kind, a special theme, and they would have been brought there specially for a program. Other circuses would stop at county seats on the railroad line, or as we talked before, coming up the canal, they would stop and the community would give them a place where they could perform. In Wabash, the circus was performed at a lot of different spots. The very first circus was performed at the corner of Canal and Wabash Street, right downtown, and it was a small affair. At Monkey Town, the Monkey Show was just a fellow who traveled around the country and would entertain kids for what he could collect from them, or a nickel a piece or something like that, very cheap, and they would perform at various locations. There were other locations down along Canal Street behind the park, to the south of the park, between the river and the park. They would try and get where there would be a creek where they could get water for their animals. Of course, Modoc escaped from the circus, and the circus at that time was being held where the Wabash Middle School is located today. There between Harrison and Miami Street.
That's where Modoc the elephant was tied up?
Yeah.
Really?
The parking lot right there to the east of the middle school was where he was tied up and was scared by the dogs and took off running.
And ran downtown?
Well, he came down, from what I gather, he came down Miami Street. There was a house on Stitt Street that claimed he went into their backyard and then came on downtown and hit Gackenheimer's pharmacy. Smell of peanuts was supposed to have attracted him there, and just ran around town and finally took out east, following the river. At LeGros, the school kids were all taken off the first floor of the school and moved up to the second floor because the principal thought an elephant wouldn't climb up the steps. So they all went up there and watched for this elephant terrorizing the community. Then over at Andrews, if I recall right, there was a farmer who was actually attacked and hurt. His back was broken or sprained from an attack by the animal. Whether it was him falling over his own feet or not, I don't know. But he later sued to reclaim monies for damage. But that was in the late 1940s when he sued to get damages from the elephant going crazy.
When circuses moved from town to town, especially early 1900s or early 1900s, it's not like they got on their cell phone and called the town and said, "Hey, we're coming through. Can we stop?" I'm assuming it was a risk. They kind of went on as they moved across the country. They just stopped in a community, and I'm assuming asked to be able to perform somewhere. That wouldn't have been necessarily something prearranged.
Normally, they had what's called an advance man. An advance man wouldn't follow the circus, would be in the lead of the circus, and he would, a week or so before, show up in a community and ask permission and pay the necessary fees and get the location for it. And then he would post signs up that a circus was coming to town on such and such a date and what kind of actors they would have and performances. And he would go in advance man, and he would set those things up. And every little circus had an advance man, and they kind of had a routine. They knew how many people would show up. So if it was a community over the last 5 years where they started out with 1,000 people and in attendance, and then it had dropped down to 400, they might skip that community and leave it for another circus that would come along.
And be on tour, just moving across the country
Right.
and
So
back.
they knew what they were doing, and they had schedules that they would follow, and they had their own railroad cars that they would take. two interesting things about Circus in Wabash that most people don't know about. Whenever a circus train would come through LeGros, it would always toot its horn. It would not do this in any other community around here. But every time it went by LeGros, it always laid on its horn and tooted until it got out of town. And that was because of one man, and his name was Printy, Bob Printy. Bob Printy was one of the greatest showmen to ever come out of Wabash. And he's one of our unsung heroes that very little people know about. He ran off and joined the circus.
He's from LeGros.
He's from LeGros. And if you ask LeGros citizens today, oh, he's that old man who used to sit down on the wall in his underwear and read the newspaper. That's him. That's what he did, all right. Bob Printy had a circus act in which he was an athletic act, is what they called it. He was a strong man. He could take nails and bend them in half. He could take iron bars and bend them over his neck. One of his famous acts was to actually allow people to tie a rope around his neck and pull it and see if they could choke him to death. And it couldn't. In fact, during World War II, he did a movie for the United States Army for the troops to show them what it was going to be like if you were captured by the Germans during the war. And in the movie, he is captured by German actors. He's taken to a tree and he's hung. They put a rope around his neck and they hang him and leave him there and go off. He did that without any support whatsoever. That was his act.
He withstood the hanging.
Yes.
He was a strong man.
You should have seen his neck. It was about that thick. I mean, this guy, I knew him. So
You knew him?
I knew him. Bob, during World War II, taught jiu-jitsu to the Marines, Army and the Marines, before they went overseas. In his act, he had a wrestling act as well as an athletic act of bending things. Strongman. In his act, anybody in the audience, I'll pay you $1 if you can throw me in a wrestling match, but you have to pay a quarter. And he never lost.
Sure.
Never lost. And the reason he never lost was we used to have a coach at Wabash High School by the name of Tom, Coach Tom. He coached the football team, and they were called the Tomcats. He coached the wrestling team, and they won the state championship in wrestling. This guy also had a national title in professional wrestling. And he brought professional wrestlers to Wabash to wrestle. The American Legion would sponsor it, and they would charge 50 cents to come watch these national wrestlers like Dick the Bruiser type people come here and wrestle. And people would turn out and watch that stuff. He even helped Coach Tom teach the high school wrestling team how to wrestle.
So that's why he was beloved then by the circus train going through LeGros, is because, I mean,
it was an honor. They would blow their whistle in honor of him every time they went through town. And for years they had their own kind of union for circus workers. And every year he would get their annual book, which would tell you who had died in the circus and where they were living and what they were doing. He kept in tabs with all these people. He knew Terrell. He knew people like that. It was just, he's a fantastic guy to understand. Also, I'm going to get a little risque again here.
Go for it.
He actually went to Indianapolis, and the art museum in Indianapolis, I can't remember its name, they hired him to pose in the nude for people painting pictures. And then from there, he went to Fort Wayne. They had an art society in Fort Wayne. He posed up there
He was in high
for
demand.
people in the nude, for people to paint his picture. Now, it didn't matter whether they're male or female because of his muscular body. And it is said, I can't prove it. I've tried to prove it. Have you ever seen these dummies that you see in sports stores that are full head size and you hit them? Those were supposed to be patterned after his features.
Oh, really?
And I cannot prove it, but supposedly when he was in Fort Wayne, somebody referred him to the people who were making those dummies, and they patterned it after the sculpture of his head.
Well, do they look like him?
I
You
think
think
it
they do?
does.
Okay.
I think it does. I really do. But in the 1950s, he gave all that fun stuff up and came back from California and settled in LaGrow and worked at Celotex and was a local character. And he was a fantastic individual. And I haven't begun to tell you half the stories about that man. He's just amazing who he was and what he did and that he came from Wabash.
Do you think there is enough for us to ever do an episode on the circus, or do you think we already hit the biggest highlights since we're not the circus capital of the world?
Well, I'll answer it this way. The second thing I was going to tell you is this. I don't know all the full details about it, but the Service Motor Truck Company, sometime around 1920, around that area, they made trucks for a circus. The circus gave up on going on trains. This one circus was small enough they could have trucks. They built the trucks and sold them to them, but the company, the circus, went belly up. They went bankrupt. So Service Motor not only got the trucks back, but they also got the circus. So for at least a year, maybe 2 years, Wabash had its own circus and its own circus grounds. And the circus, we hear of the circus in Peru having its winter grounds. Believe it or not, Wabash had a winter grounds. They had circus headquarters during the winter on Carroll Street, where the old city street department was located.
South Carroll Street?
South Carroll Street, where the old city street department was located. Today, you'll be talking about the sewer plant. Come back this way just a little bit. And that was winter circus grounds for the Service Motor Truck Circus. And most people aren't aware of that. Also, there were local farmers around the Rich Valley area, Somerset, and Rowan, who during the winter would house some of the animals as well. Some of the local veterinarians who had offices in town here would take care of those animals and talked about going out to sedate a tiger or lion or elephant, what have you.
What year did you think that was? When the Service Motor Company?
Somewhere around 1920 to 1923.
Did the Service Airport Company also have an airport?
Yes, ma'am. The service
Was that the one by Kroger?
was called, Satco was the name of the company. They were a division of Service Motor Company, and they made airplanes, and they also had an airport. The airport was located on Cass Street in Coleraine. I'm trying to think of what's there now.
The
Mexican restaurant.
Yeah, the Mexican restaurant, and just next to it is the old Lighthouse Mission location, that white building too. Sits to its south on that corner.
What used to be Marsh Do you remember Marsh Grocery?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Marsh Grocery Store. That area was the Satco hangar was located there, and the airport was located there. And when they went out of business, it turned into oh boy, I forgot the name of it now. It turned into a dance hall.
Yeah.
The hangar was turned into a large
Fun.
dance hall and operated through the 30s. Later on, it became a sale barn, and then it burned down. But it was located, its southernmost boundary would have been right there at Coleraine, between Coleraine and Harrison. There we go.
Well, Mr. Woodward, that's been 1 hour.
Hi, I'm Ron Woodward, and these are the Woodward Chronicles. Thanks for listening.
The Woodward Chronicles podcast is made possible by the generous support of the Lisa Gilman Investment Fund, the Sandra Kunkel Trust, Mark and Amy Ford, Paperworks Industries, the Community Foundation of Wabash County, and Visit Wabash County, and is created by Destination Wabash County.